Hello and welcome to Critical Line Item. My name is Tom Rablick. Thank you so much for joining me for this particular podcast. Over much of 2023, there's been an intense focus on the way in which government procures services from the private sector, that is, consulting firms such as Bain and Boston Consulting, McKinsey, PwC, Deloitte, you name it. And a range of issues have emerged, be they management of conflicts, be they ethical conduct, be they um, the way in which the public sector itself leans on the services of consulting firms to, in some respects, deflect any decision making on their part, any responsibility on their part. Now, one of the people who's been gently tickling people underfoot is Senator Barbara Pocock, who represents the Australian Greens in the Senate. She's from South Australia, and I've got again the privilege of speaking with her to look at how the inquiry has unfolded, but also where she thinks things will shape up. Barbara, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Tom. It's great to be back and talking about an issue that I didn't think would dominate my life quite in the way it has, but is, very interesting and important, of course, to government, to taxpayers, and to business.
If we begin um, this conversation at this point, um, if this committee hearing inquiry rather was a marathon, you're two-thirds through it.
Mm.
What are some of the key issues that are emerging for you as you look at what you've already seen um, over the past 6 to 7 months of the inquiry running?
Mm. Well, I think there are a range of quite specific issues around the massive growth in consulting, for example, and a bunch of tendencies and issues that have emerged in the last few months. But I must say, for me, for someone who's worked, in a research capacity inside universities and worked, in the employment sector for 20 or 30 years, I have found it really fascinating about the culture that I have seen presented to the Senate in this inquiry. And I think of the culture that I've seen, first experienced when I joined the Senate a year ago through estimates. It's a very respectful exchange. Sure, sometimes departments try and bat you off and get you out of their face. They don't want to give you everything you want, but it is a genuine exchange. Whereas I feel like what we have seen through successive hearings from the big four in particular that we've talked with so far, EY, KPMG, Deloitte, is a real polite but real reluctance to come clean about what the public has been witnessing in recent months. And we have really seen, one scandal after another unfold, some of which have been quite jaw-dropping in terms of conflicts of interest, in terms of huge spends, in terms of massive growth from small projects into huge ones with very limited outcomes in some cases. I mean, some genuine scandals. And I felt that the Senate at times has not been treated with the respect that it should be by entities that have drawn on hundreds of millions of dollars, indeed billions of dollars, of public dollars in recent years. And I have found that quite shocking. I mean, I worked in a sector where you applied for money to do research. You expected to be held accountable for any monies you received. You needed to show an outcome. You're regularly monitored on the way you spent that money. And I think there's a level of arrogance and a level of concealment and a level of failure to take up responsibility for some of the really serious misdemeanors that have been revealed in the consulting sector, and that surprised me. That has surprised me, I must say.
Yeah, that speaks to a couple of things, doesn't it? On the one hand, it's transparency, and on the other hand, it's oversight.
mm,
And then there's a third element, which is accountability for outcomes. So you've got three
mm.
things, transparency, uh, oversight, and accountability for outcomes. Now, um, one of the challenges in transparency is that the firms tend to the firms don't tend to like people um, prying or asking questions in any case, regardless of their structure. Um,
Mm,
what are the things that you would like to see happen in terms of
mm,
transparency
mm.
of the sector?
Well, I think you're hitting on three really important themes there. Certainly, transparency and oversight and accountability. But I think there is an overarching issue for me, which is the size of this incredible sector, which has grown so quickly in the last few years. I mean, we saw earlier prime ministers, Labor and Liberal, turn to consulting in the decade before, certainly some growth, but we have seen really a surprising and very steep increase in spending that goes to the big four and to consulting more broadly and contracting out. So for me, there's an overarching issue. When you ask what action, we're moving towards, what needs to change. I think one of the things that before we get to transparency is this sector has grown way too quickly and it is now doing some very inappropriate things. The core design of an agency, for example, design of a strategic plan for a public agency, the design of big programs and their implementation and evaluation. I view all of those functions as core public sector functions, and they have been given over to private contractors in the last 5 years in increasing numbers. So it's not just, are we managing contracts properly and are people accountable and is there proper oversight? I think what we've actually done at a fundamental level is privatise a very big slice of activities that should be actually conducted by the federal, state, and even local government. So that's for me a prior concern. So when I look at where we need to go, we see a Labor government which is certainly interested in and is acting to reduce its dependence and over reliance on private consultants. And I think that is a very important first thing. And I think they have been surprised by the extent of the growth in consulting and I think that partly, that massive growth very quickly, partly explains some of the really scandalous things we have seen, which is, contracts have not been properly managed. There has not been accountability, certainly hasn't been transparency. So then if we go to, so my overarching thing is we need to reduce dependence. We need to grow the public sector, and we especially need to grow the capability in the public sector, which offers really good careers to the smartest people coming out of our universities, so that instead of saying, I can't wait to do a placement in EY, they instead think, I can't wait to work, in the department, in Treasury, and make a contribution to the public interest. I think we have to make the public sector a desirable place for our best talent to want to go and work and have a career in. And I think we're a fair way from that right now. So there's a whole lot of rebuilding of the public sector, cutting back on consulting we need to do. But then we go inside the box, which is where you're pointing to, transparency. Yes, we need to know a lot more about these contracts. For example, the existing machinery for managing contracts, even recording how much is let to consultants, is incredibly inadequate. We know all too little about many very sizable contracts across departments, but particularly in a place like defence, where it's a black box. It's very unclear what the contracts are in many cases. They're not easily accessible for the public to look at, to know whether we're getting value for money, how many of the contracts actually have gone to a competitive tender, what were the criteria for deciding on things. There's a whole lot of aspects around letting contracts, managing contracts, and getting value for money out of them, which I think we really need to rebuild to get decent transparency into this system, which I hope will be a smaller system, a smaller industry into the future.
One of the ways in which you can do that, surely, is to replicate a register like the lobbyist register that we have for people who are lobbyists to government, where
Yeah.
they have the name, the corporate structure, the corporate origin, if you like, um, and in the case of lobbyists, the sort of clients they represent. I mean, surely that there are things that we already do
Mm,
that we can capitalise on, so the public can see
mm,
whether it be a sole trader or whether it be somebody that is uh, in a, or whether it be a large global consultancy, so that you've got the full span represented on a public record. Um,
mm,
so it's
mm,
visible and it's transparent. You know who's getting money and why.
mm. And for what? And what
Yeah.
were the outcomes? Yes, I think we need to have a lot more transparency there. I would like to see a general preference for the publication of consultancy outcomes, for example, so that you're expected to publish an outcome, a report you may produce as a consultant, and that there needs to be a special argument for not publishing. At the moment, a very, very small proportion of our consultancy outcomes are available for the public to look at, or for the parliament even necessarily to look at. And we know that one of the drivers for the use of consultants is obscurity about what's being contracted. I mean, I think when you do something as a department, you're potentially up for defending what you do at estimates. You're up for questions on notice. There's a whole lot of quite important transparency measures that if you're in the public sector doing work, you're exposed to and expected to respond to. As soon as you give 500 million off to something as a consultant activity, all of that machinery of transparency is not available, and it should be. We actually should be able to call significant consultancy projects before estimates to have a look at them, because it's all public dollars, and we need much more transparency about those activities and much better records as well.
So you're looking. Your one of your issues is how do you look at what's on the dark side of the moon?
Yeah, yeah, we shouldn't have to wait for a really smart investigative journalist to tell us that a consultant's firm is both setting the parameters for a program and advising a bunch of private corporate clients on how to deal with those requirements. I mean, there's very direct conflicts of interest that we should not be waiting for a headline in a newspaper to know about. So I would like the public sector and the arrangements around consultants to give us a much more direct look at who's doing what.
One of the things that I've discovered recently in reading a transcript that emanates from the New South Wales inquiry that a state-based colleague of yours, Abigail Boyd, is chairing into the same subject matter, incidentally. And one of the things
Mm,
in the Accountants Professional and Ethical Standards Board, ABSP, a mouthful in its own right, has put forward is developing an ethical standard for the accounting profession, specifically for management consulting. Is that
mm.
something you would encourage them to think about?
Well, it has been very surprising to learn that there is no professional body, there are no professional standards for the consulting industry. And I think that is a real gap, and certainly needs to be considered. I mean, I'm spitballing here, we are not at the point of drafting recommendations quite yet. But I think we certainly need to be looking at ways in which professional standards in this world are set and then are enforced. And I am very concerned about making sure we keep the fox out of the henhouse on that kind of professional standard setting. I've been very concerned, for example, about the way in which significant players with real skin in the game um, are, members of things like the Tax Practitioners Board, the taxation machinery, and I want to make sure. I think people need to uh, be clean of current engagement to participate in professional standards or other machinery of governance for a profession, including the machinery of taxation. I think there are ways in which a smart legislator could try and separate those, so we don't build in conflicts of interest as we try and manage our way to a
So
more
you would you would
ethical
you would see a
transfer.
world where, for example, um, the current composition of the accounting and auditing standards boards have got active partners from major accounting firms.
Hmm.
Um, you
Yep.
would prefer a situation where you have knowledgeable individuals who are not necessarily employed within the professional firms sitting on those boards to set those standards. Am I right?
Yes, my view is there are people with expertise who will stand up for the public interest, but also understand the industry and the circumstances of that work and be useful commentators in helping us to get the transparency, accountability, and professional standards that we need. And we manage it in many occupations and professions, and I think we need to be able to do it in the world of consulting. It's trickier in the world of consulting because it's such a concentrated industry. We've got the big four, the big seven, who are very, very dominant in the sector. But I think we really need to be looking at ways in which we can draw on expertise without embedding conflicts of interest. Because people really want to know they can trust the bodies that are there to make sure the right thing is done, and that the public interest is served, and that people are not exploiting conflicts of interest.
One of the things that you've obviously been in the middle of while we're looking at professional firms, etc., is examining the procurement mechanisms of government. The
Mm,
House of Representatives, sorry, the JCPAA rather, but chaired by Julian Hill,
mm,
released a report recently
mm,
on procurement. Um, what are the things that you can draw on from that report for the
mm.
inquiry that you're currently doing in the Senate?
I found the report of that committee very interesting, and I think it really illuminates usefully one aspect of the consulting work that we've been inquiring into, and that is the government capability to actually manage, to let contracts, to ensure that they are managed effectively. And I think that report says there are real concerns about the process of procurement, and that we need to be much more on the ball in managing and letting contracts. And I also want to acknowledge the role that many insiders are playing from within the Big Four and Big Seven, who regularly are contacting the senators and are saying, you guys are being treated like mugs. Many projects, and I had a recent long conversation, for example, with a whistleblower from within one of the Big Four who went through what it's like, how blind government is. For example, the commentary he made was that it's often not till quite close to the end of a contract, very large contracts, that government officers will come in and say, oh, well, how's it going? Where are we up to on deliverables? Suddenly find near the end of a project, deliverables are way short of what's expected or needed. And that suddenly leads to a new contract out of the first contract. And because the project has not been properly monitored by officials on the way through, they hit a crunch point and a massive new contract can result subsequently. So, not good value for money, not proper management. So what this person is suggesting is much closer monitoring on the way through contract, much more detailed worksheets about who's doing what. We are hearing a lot about very senior partners landing a contract, but then using much more junior and of course much cheaper people to do the work on a contract, and then the senior person comes in at the last minute and sorts it out and fixes it if they can. So I think the public deserve much better value of monitoring on the way through to make sure the right people with the right expertise are actually delivering on multi-million-dollar contracts, so that we don't find additional contracts flowing from a failed first completion. So yeah, I think our machinery of government really needs to be fixed. But I do want to make that basic point, which is some of this work should not be contracted out in the first place. It should be run from within a robust public sector. And I'm particularly thinking, for example, of a contract announced this week, 8.5 million in the Department of Defence to set up the regulatory body for managing the nuclear elements of the waste in the AUKUS project. I mean, that's contracting out the entire design of an authority that's on very delicate terrain and should be, in my view, something which is done in-house. The contract was let to EY. Well, I think often what I hear from whistleblowers is the expertise of the Big Four is often overstated with big claims about credentials and experience, which are not often clearly validated. And I think we need to do a whole lot of things about making sure we've got really experts where we need them on projects where we do not have the capability within the public sector. I think there's some big questions there for us to increase that capability. And Julian Hill, who's very funny in the way he, if ever you want to amuse yourself, the forward to that report that he gave was hilarious. But at this, talking about commitment issues and the way in which he phrases that report is entertaining, but it's a really important issue. It's a lot of money. $80 billion is let out in those contracts across the public sector, and we don't have strong systems of management. His report shows very clearly. And Department of Finance doesn't always help agencies make sure that robust management is there to back them up.
Uh, I've been talking to Senator Barbara Pocock from the Australian Greens, who's in the middle of trying to sort out the mess, along with some of her colleagues, that consultants and public servants have left the rest of us to look at. You've been generous with your time. If I can wrap this up with one final question, that is, does the committee intend to hold some more hearings before it reports in November?
Yes, we have got more hearings planned on the way through. We'll have some days of taking further evidence. And I think we've got plenty of issues that we need to now begin moving towards exploring, thinking about what are the changes that we need? How do we deal with, endemic built-in conflicts of interest inside large consultants that are doing both audit, consulting and tax work? We need to go to the question of, in terms of transparency, political donations and how they should be managed when you're in receipt of a government contract. Should you also be a donor to the major parties? And I think we've got some really interesting work to do around what the structure of an appropriate consulting body is. A partnership is very different. And I know you and I've talked about this before, from a corporation which has got, much stronger requirements of transparency than a partnership. So I think we've got plenty of interesting terrain ahead. And other committees, as you pointed out, Julian Hills and Deb O'Neill is also going further with the joint committee on corporations, looking at questions of structure. I think the Parliament has some really important work here to make sure that the Australian taxpayer can be confident that their taxes are being well spent and that their public sector is really built for the projects and the challenges that are coming at us hard and fast. We can't deal with the climate crisis by relying on EY, KPMG, PwC and Deloitte. We need capability in our government and in our public sector to deal with massive challenges and to make sure our spending is appropriate.
Senator Barbara Pocock, thank you for your time.
Great to be with you, Tom.